Hello friends, welcome to today's lecture on Postcolonial State, Key Debates and Theoretical Reflections. The major objectives of the lecture are 1. Understanding the concept of postcolonial state and its features. 2. Examining the liberal modernist perspective on postcolonial state. 3. Exploring the neo-Marxist or dependency and underdevelopment perspective on postcolonial state. 4. Understanding the structural Marxist or relative autonomy thesis vis-a-vis postcolonial state. And 5. Highlighting the contemporary feminist perspective on postcolonial state. Dear students, in a comparative perspective, the concept and institution of state can be examined in different ways. For example, in terms of theories of its evolution, its nature, working, and so on. It can also be studied in the perspective of colonial or postcolonial state. And today, our discussion is about the key debates and theoretical reflections on postcolonial state. Dear friends, the scope and coverage of the term postcolonial varies across disciplinary fields as well as with scholars. For example, being much broader in scope in literary studies than say in political science. Again, some authors include former settler colonies as referents along the non-settler colonies, while others such as Amina Mama distinguish the term postcolonial from post-imperial. For her, the term postcolonial refers to the former colonies, whereas post-imperial refers to former imperial powers. In temporal terms, postcolonial not only refers to the period after colonialism, but assumes continuity. In terms of continued effects of processes initiated during colonialism as well as discontinuity in terms of new processes unfolding subsequently. The term postcolonial is used here to refer to the study of the attempted transformation, successful or otherwise, of former colonies in the context of changing imperial conditions. Likewise, the term postcolonial state is applied here to the new nation states that emerged out of the process of decolonization in the post-World War II period. As with other uses of the term postcolonial, it refers both to this temporal characteristic coming after colonialism as well as to a number of other features related to the state's emergence from colonialism. These other features include the ways in which post-colonial states exhibit aspects of statehood borrowed from the colonial power, such as the adoption of aspects of the British parliamentary system by ex-British colonies such as India. Attention has also been drawn to the ways in which the post-colonial states retained colonial era boundaries, institutions, and political processes. Some scholars trace aspects of post-colonial politics such as political authoritarianism and highly ethnicized politics to this history. Post-colonial states have been characterized both in terms of their political and economic agenda and in terms of their infrastructural capacity. Most post-colonial states embarked on interventionist program of development. However, their capacity to implement their programs was affected crucially by their ability to implement political decisions and the strength of their political infrastructure. Strong states are thus distinguished from merely despotic ones and from weak states where such infrastructure is lacking. State capacity is of course linked to the economic resources available to the state, but also to the evolving relations between the political executive and the bureaucracy on the one hand and state and civil society on the other. The embeddedness of the state in society has been regarded by some as a feature of strong state in the sense that it gains the cooperation of important state and societal interest groups, and by others as characterizing a weak state where the state is penetrated by civil society and interest groups that are too strong for it to control. Weak capacity in post-colonial states is also linked to levels of political violence, in that the governability of a society is dependent upon the political infrastructure of the state, and where this is ineffective, the state increasingly relies upon the use of violence. Governability is thus a continuing and growing concern for post-colonial states. As a result of economic and political reforms, processes of globalization, and in some cases rapid economic growth, there is some debate as to whether the form of statehood characteristic of the independent era are being transcended. While some point to the modernization of political systems and the state institutions and the growth of civil society, others highlight the hollowing out of the state and the prospect of further economic subordination to the powerful external actors in a race to the bottom. The post-colonial state has come under extensive theoretical scrutiny, and consequently there have emerged a series of debates analyzing the nature and characteristics of the post-colonial state. Since the process of decolonization, the institution of state has emerged as an important focus of study among political scientists and political economists. In the 1950s and 60s, the post-colonial states derived their plans in the context of Keynesian economics, the Soviet experiment, and the emergence of development economics. Also, different interpretations and theories are offered to analyze the nature and role of state in newly independent countries. Now, let us briefly examine the liberal modernist perspective on post-colonial state. Dear friends, the liberal approach considers the state as an instrument of socio-economic, political, and cultural modernization. Modernization theorists in the 1950s and 60s treated the post-colonial state as the principal tool in transforming the backward and underdeveloped societies along progressive lines. It is to be remembered that the process of modernization in the West was the outcome of Industrial Revolution. In the developing countries, on the contrary, it was the product of decolonization. The prime motive of the overall modernization process was to recover from the underdevelopment created by colonialism. And in this direction, the state vis-a-vis market took the initiative to modernize the society, polity, economy, and culture. The post-colonial state focused all developmental efforts towards the fulfillment of the objective of modernization through an effective process of national reconstruction. That is, reconstruction of their ideologies, culture, administration, economy, social norms, education, etc. Social modernization implies universalization of values, achievement orientation, motivation, and increasing mobility. Economic modernization involves the transformation of economies from poor agricultural subsistence societies to modern industrial societies. It also strives to make a balance between public and private sector in the economic development of the country. The state, as the chief political institution, actively engaged in the process of institution building. Its institutions like political parties, legislative bodies, bureaucracy, and the system of elections based on universal adult franchise. Cultural modernization aims at a rational outlook, scientific temper, humanism, egalitarianism, and freedom. So, dear students, the interventionist role of the state can be seen not only as an instrument for development, but also of modernization. The liberals also consider the state as an instrument for nation building. It is to be remembered that in Europe, nation created the state, but in the post-colonial societies, the state supposedly created the nation. The existence of wide social, cultural and economic cleavages and the multiplicity of identities initially hindered the emergence of a nation. Hence, the post-colonial states initiated a rigorous task of building a national identity by assimilating the diverse cleavages. However, along with the nation building process, the post-colonial states also engaged in the process of institution building. Both these processes were simultaneous. At the same time, the Western paradigm used for these processes created a lot of strain, rather than ensuring a smooth functioning of the nation and the democratic institutions in these post-colonial societies. Failure to recognize the phenomenon of diversity of different identities generated anomie trends in the form of communalism, ethnic nationalism and regional identity, as well as secessionism and so on. In the institution building process also, the state failed to transform the colonial content of political institutions. This in a way resulted in its dysfunctioning. Now, dear students, we will discuss the neo-Marxist perspectives, that is dependency and underdevelopment. In the 1960s and 1970s, a strong critique of the modernization or political development perspective emerged with the onset of Third World nationalism on the one hand and the rise of neo-Marxism on the other. The criticism was both on methodological and ideological grounds. It led to a paradigm shift in thinking about nature of post-colonial state. The shift was visible in the writings of the Marxist theorists from Asia, Africa and Latin America. One factor that led to the shift was the failure of the post-colonial state to deliver even the most fundamentals at a time when the state was the focal point of hopes and aspirations of the people. For the dependency theorists, the underdevelopment of the post-colonial state was a product of encounter between the capitalist West and the colonized people of Asia, Africa and Latin America. Colonialism gave birth to underdevelopment, and even after gaining independence, continuing ties of economic dependency served to maintain neocolonialism in the form of development of underdevelopment. As Atul Kohli and Vivani Shu have pointed out, the dependency theorists differed from the modernization or political development theorists and found them ahistorical and excessively formal. They contested the modernization perspective that the states in Asia, Africa and Latin America were in the early stages of development. They also criticized the modernization of political development theorists for having an ethnocentric bias, in the sense that they sought to provide intellectual clocks to cover the continued Western agenda for continuing to dominate and exploit the post-colonial societies covertly. In any case, by the 60s, the post-colonial state as an agent of either social transformation or economic reforms and political change was greatly delegitimized. The delegitimization was very much a product of the people's dismal experiences of the role of state and the state elite. In the neo-Marxist theorization on the post-colonial state, external determinants were given much more importance, and one aspect was particularly stressed, namely the history of the relationship of the post-colonial state to the colonialism and imperialism. The dependency theorists, by highlighting neocolonialism, chose to advocate resistance against both capitalism and imperialism. Arguments for external determinants were derived from underdevelopment and dependency theorists led by Ander Gunder Frank, a Latin American political economist, and the subsequent revisions by Samir Amin, Immanuel Wallerstein, Arhegi Immanuel and Cardoso, among others. They believed that the world was an integrated world economic system in which advanced capitalist countries constituted the core and developing countries of Asia, Africa and Latin America constituted the peripheries. Subsequently, the World Economic System theorists added another category of semi-peripheries consisting of the newly industrialized countries of Asia, also known as Asian tigers like Singapore, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, Taiwan and so on. These dependency theorists argued that capitalism is an international system characterized by the exchange between technically advanced developed states and primary product producing underdeveloped states through an integrated network of market. The technical and military superiority of the developed states, also referred to as the metropolitan states, result in the domination, exploitation and distortion of the post-colonial states, also referred as the peripheral states. Through the process of unequal exchange, the economic surplus is extracted from the periphery through plunder, repatriation of super profits, deteriorating terms of trade and monopoly rents for the utilization of the metropolis technologies, as well as trade and tariff policies that deny the periphery control over the internal markets. The most significant aspect of this dominance in the world economic system is surplus extraction by the metropolitan countries. Unequal exchange denies the economic surplus to the peripheral states, which is necessary for their autonomous national development. The economic surplus is appropriated by and invested in the advanced capitalist states. According to the underdevelopment or dependency theory, the rapid economic development of the metropolitan states has happened at the cost of underdevelopment of the dependent states of Asia and Africa. For the neo-Marxists, decolonization brought no substantive change to the economy of post-colonial states, and the indirect political dominance of the metropolitan bourgeois from the former imperial countries has actually continued unabated. Thus, the post-colonial states, according to the neo-Marxist theorists, was simply a new form. Political freedom for the local classes was merely a new clock under which the basic mechanisms of imperialist hegemony continued to sustain. The post-colonial state remained a dependent political apparatus. The governing class and bureaucracy in the post-colonial dependent state formulated policies that coincide with the long-term interests of the metropolitan or the neo-imperialist states. Governing class in the dependency theory literature is regarded as a comprador class, a client group, an auxiliary bourgeois. And in the words of A.G. Frank, the exigencies of the process of capital accumulation and the international division of labor worldwide and in the underdeveloped countries themselves thus becomes the principal determinant of the role and the form of the state in the third world. Dependency theorists further argue that the post-colonial state may be strong and autonomous in relation to its local bourgeois, but it remains largely an instrument of metropolitan bourgeois. Thus, the dependency theorists were of the view that the dominant class alliance in the post-colonial states remained the same as they were in the colonial period. The only difference was that the peripheral bourgeois now replaced the old feudal and comprador elements as the subordinate ally. This class, according to Samir Amin, remains in collusion with imperialist forces. Now, dear students, we will talk about the relative autonomy perspective. Dear friends, the concept of post-colonial state that emerged in the 70s was epitomized in the seminal research article of the renowned Pakistani scholar Hamza Alawi entitled "The State in Post-Colonial Societies, Pakistan and Bangladesh." Alawi provided an early starting point for the analysis of the state in post-colonial societies. He premised his arguments on the historical specificity of post-colonial societies. This specificity, he argued, aroused from the structural changes brought about by the colonial experience and alignment of the classes and by the superstructure of political and administrative institutions which were established in that context. And secondly, the realignment of class forces which have been brought about in the context of post-colonial situation. Alavi argued that the post-colonial state dispenses with the mediation of politics because the state is overdeveloped, a superstructure capable of dominating all indigenous social forces. This allows aspects of the state itself, the military and the bureaucracy, to play the dominant part in the state and among social classes. Alavi ascribed the genesis of the overdeveloped superstructure or state apparatus to the colonial past of the post-colonial societies, where the task of carrying out the bourgeois revolution was exercised by the metropolitan capital and in the process of imposition of colonial rule. In that process, it was necessary for the colonial regime to create a state apparatus that was sufficiently powerful to subordinate the indigenous social classes. It was this overdeveloped state apparatus that the post-colonial state inherited after decolonization. Thus, Alavi refers to this syndrome as the excessive enlargement of powers of control and regulation that the state acquires extends far beyond the logic of what is necessary in the interests of the orderly functioning of the peripheral capitalist economies over which the state presides and specific needs of each of the dominant classes. The centrality of the state in the post-colonial society can be explained with the help of three factors. First, the continued dominance of the state apparatus in the post-colonial societies was due to the matrix of class society. At the time of independence, no single class had exclusive command over the state. Alavi argued that the special role of the military bureaucratic oligarchy has become all too common a phenomena in post-colonial societies. This role now needs to be interpreted in terms of a new alignment of the respective interests of the three proprietary exploiting classes, namely the indigenous bourgeois, the metropolitan neo-colonialist bourgeois, and the landed classes under metropolitan patronage. It follows that in the writings of the underdevelopment or dependency theorists, the state managers, that is the politicians constituting overdeveloped state apparatus, mediate into the interests of the proprietary classes. For this purpose, the state needs relative autonomy because competing interests have to be reconciled within the peripheral structure. The post-colonial state is thus not an instrument of a single class. It is relatively autonomous and mediates between the competing interests of the three dominant proprietary classes and preserves the social order based on peripheral capitalist order. Second, a complementary point that can be drawn from the writings of Alavi is that the state in post-colonial societies directly appropriates a very large part of the economic surplus and deploys it in bureaucratically directed economic activities under peripheral capitalism. Third, according to Alavi and John Searle, yet another factor that underlines the crucial significance of the state in post-colonial societies is the particular ideological function of the state. In the words of Searle, the state's function of providing ideological cement for the capitalist system is one which has gradually evolved in the core countries in line with their economic transformation. However, in post-colonial societies, this hegemonic position has to be created and created within territorial boundaries, which often appears quite artificial once the powerful force of direct colonial fate has been removed. Like advanced capitalism, even peripheral capitalism requires territorial unity and legitimacy, which has to be created by the post-colonial state. So, these three factors taken together illuminate the centrality of the state to the post-colonial social formations, as the neo-Marxists have argued. In such a situation of high relative autonomy, the bureaucracy figures as an essential component in its own right to determine the state policies. So, finally, dear students, we will briefly examine the feminist perspective on post-colonial state. So, dear friends, in contrast to the approaches that we discussed already, a key debate among the feminist analysts of the post-colonial state concern the extent to which the state is able to act as a vehicle for social change aimed at increasing gender equality. For example, in Morocco, in the early 1990s, the modernizing state drove women into the public arena through law and education. The other side of the debate concerns the state as a mechanism for male social control and the convergence between the state and the patriarchal forces. Where politics becomes deeply communalized, particularly when it is supported by the state-sponsored religious fundamentalism, the traditional control over women that rested with particular male individuals like fathers, brother, husband or so on, it shifted to all men. Feminist political scientist Sonia Alvarez argues that there is nothing essential about state's ability to act in either direction, that is social change or social control, but that its trajectory is more likely to be determined by political regime and historical conjecture. The feminist analyst Shireen Rai conceptualizes the state as a network of power relations that are located in economic, political, legal and cultural forms interacting with and against each other. This allows her to examine the state in the context of social relations shaped by systems of power, which are themselves affected by struggles against these systems. Rai points out that the state may take different forms in different historical, social and economic contexts, as in the case of post-colonial states emerging from struggle against imperialism and colonial rule. The nationalist opposition to colonialism was itself located within the modernizing framework favored by colonialists. The prioritization of goals, first by nationalist movement and then by the post-colonial state, erased issues that potentially challenged the modernist development conceptions of the new nation state, such as women's interest and rights. Rai highlights three features of post-colonial states that are significant for women's strategizing for social change. The first concerns the transformative role of the state. Most nationalist elites saw themselves as agents for social and economic transformation, and state institutions were also relatively autonomous from dominant social classes. This allowed space for institutional and political struggles. Second, the infrastructural capacity of the state is uneven, resulting in the possibility of activists targeting sympathetic institutions and individuals within the state. Third, the existing level of corruption is an important determinant of whether negotiation within the state is possible or not. Rai points out that one of the important implications of the post-structuralist conception of power as dispersed is the recognition that power takes diverse forms and can be used in varied ways. Simply taken, an adversarial position against the state may be positively dangerous for women given the deeply masculinist characteristics of the society, including the civil society. The feminist perspective moves us beyond the conventional dominating perspectives to explore the trajectory of gender and woman experiences vis-a-vis the post-colonial state. So, dear students, to conclude, since the process of decolonization, the institution of state has emerged as an important focus of study among political scientists and political economists. As already stated, in the 1950s and 60s, the post-colonial states derived their plans in the context of Keynesian economics, the Soviet experiment and the emergence of development economics. Similarly, different interpretations and theories offered to analyze the nature and role of the state in newly independent countries. The two major approaches, liberal and Marxist, interpreted the nature of post-colonial states according to their respective positions on the state itself. Most of the political scientists adopted either of these two approaches to locate the nature of the post-colonial state. The liberal perspective analyzed the trajectory of post-colonial state through the prism of modernization and considered the state as an instrument of socio-economic, political and cultural modernization. While the Marxist approach, on the other hand, perceives the post-colonial state differently. The Marxists interpret the state as an instrument of class domination and an executive committee for managing the affairs of the bourgeois. Their attitude towards the post-colonial state was in tune with their basic stand on the state. For Marxists, the post-colonial state was the principal agent for the development of capitalism in the post-colonial era. Finally, the feminist perspective, drawing on a wide range of disciplines, explores the gendered state processes, the implications for women, and strategies for realizing gender justice in the post-colonial states. So, dear students, let us end here. I hope you would have enjoyed the lecture. Goodbye and stay blessed.